The candlelight beyond the ballroom doors, as Lady Seraphina Ashbourne stood in a gown that was not her own, believed they were witnessing the engagement of a duke to a stranger she loved. They did not know her name meant for another woman. They did not know that 6 months earlier, this same woman had scrubbed these very floors on her knees, that she had carried his linens, drawn his bath, and stood silent in corners, while he spoke of a fiancé he had never met and did not want. They did not know that the ring on her finger had been promised to her before she was born, stolen from her the moment her father died, and returned to her only through a deception so dangerous that one misstep could have ended in her ruin, or worse. To understand how a penniless maid came to stand at the center of the grandest engagement London had seen in a decade, we must go back. We must go back to the night her father's carriage never came home. If this story of stolen names, hidden crowns, and a love built on lies moves you even now, before the truth unravels, consider staying close, for what follows will test everything you believe about who deserves a title and who deserves a heart. Subscribe if you wish to walk beside her through the darker rooms of this house, because the woman polishing silver in the opening scene and the woman wearing that ring are, impossibly, unforgivably, the same. Now let us return to the beginning, to a spring evening 8 months before that ballroom, when Seraphina Ashbourne was still an heiress, and grief had not yet taught her how to disappear. The Ashbourne estate sat on a low hill above the Thames Valley, a house of pale stone and tall windows that had belonged to her family for 4 generations, and on the evening her father did not return from London, Seraphina had been standing at one of those windows, counting the minutes by the movement of the clouds. She was 19, dark-haired, quick of mind, raised by a father who had treated her less like a decoration and more like an heir, teaching her the estate's ledgers before she was taught to dance. When the messenger arrived instead of the carriage, when his hat came off before his mouth opened, she understood before a single word was spoken that her life had already changed shape, the way a room changes shape the moment a lamp goes out. Her father, Lord Edmund Ashbourne, had been thrown from his carriage on the London road. The official account called it an accident. The coroner's report called it an accident. But her father's steward, an old man named Hobbs who had served the family since before Seraphina was born, pulled her aside at the funeral with hands that would not stop shaking, and told her that the wheel of that carriage had not broken by chance, that he had examined it himself before it was quietly removed and destroyed by order of a man who had no authority to order anything in that house. That man was her father's cousin, Lord Reginald Casworth, and by the strange cruelty of English inheritance law, with no direct male heir, Casworth stood to inherit everything Seraphina had ever known. She did not believe Hobbs at first, not truly, because grief has a way of making even the most loyal servant sound like a man chasing shadows, and because Casworth arrived at the funeral wearing an expression of such convincing sorrow that half the county wept alongside him. He embraced Seraphina before her father's grave was even filled, and told her, in a voice thick with false tenderness, that he would see her cared for as though she were his own daughter. Within a week she understood what that care would look like. The household accounts were seized under the guise of settling her father's debts. Servants who had known her since infancy were dismissed one by one, replaced by staff loyal only to Casworth. Her father's private study, the room where he had once taught her to read a balance sheet, was locked, and when she demanded entry, she was told, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, that grieving girls should not trouble themselves with matters of business. It was Hobbs who first spoke the word marriage in relation to her future, and it was Hobbs who told her, in the shadow of the stables where Casworth's new men could not overhear, that a contract existed, drawn up years before by her father and an old friend from his university days. A contract that promised Seraphina's hand, not to some convenient stranger Casworth might select to strip the estate bare, but to the son of a duke, a boy she had met only once as a child, and had not thought of in a decade. That boy was now a man, and he now held the title Duke of Ashcombe, having inherited it after his own father's death 2 years prior. If that contract could be found, if it could be honored before Casworth found a way to bury it as thoroughly as he had buried the truth of her father's death, Seraphina's future might yet slip from her cousin's grasp. But Casworth was not a careless man, and he had already begun to whisper a different story through the drawing rooms of London, one in which the ash-worn fortune had been so badly mismanaged by a grieving, foolish girl that no respectable family would wish to align themselves with what remained of it. Seraphina spent that summer watching her home become a stranger's house, watching Casworth's men catalogue the silver, the paintings, the very chairs her mother had chosen before her death, all while smiling at her over dinner as though nothing at all had changed. She learned, in those months, the particular loneliness of being watched by people who no longer answered to her, of being a guest in the only home she had ever known. And she learned something else, something that would matter more than she yet understood. She learned to listen at doors, to read the faces of men who thought a grieving girl too broken to notice anything at all. It was through one such door, late on an August night, that she overheard Casworth speaking to a man she did not recognize, a man with a moneylender's careful voice, discussing a debt that did not exist, a forged signature bearing her father's hand, and a plan to have Seraphina declared unfit to inherit before the season's end. She pressed her palm against the cold wood of that door and understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that she was not merely losing her inheritance, she was being erased. She did not sleep that night. She sat instead at the small writing desk in her chambers, the one piece of furniture Casworth had not yet thought to claim, and by candlelight she wrote a single letter addressed to Hobbs, asking him to find whatever remained of the marriage contract her father had spoken of, wherever it might be hidden, before the summer ended and there was nothing left of her to save. Hobbs found the contract 3 weeks later, tucked inside the false bottom of a strongbox her father had kept in the old gamekeeper's cottage, a place Casworth's men had not thought to search, because no one still living knew it existed, except an old steward and a grieving girl who had once, years ago, watched her father hide something there and asked no questions. The paper was yellowed, sealed with wax long since cracked, but the signatures were unmistakable. Her father's careful hand beside that of a man named Ashcombe, promising the union of their children upon Seraphina's 21st year or upon either father's death, whichever came first. Her father had died. The contract was binding. And yet Hobbs delivered this discovery to her with a face so grave that Seraphina understood immediately there was more to the story than good fortune. Casworth already knew. Somehow, impossibly, he already knew the contract existed, and he had spent the better part of the summer ensuring that Seraphina would never be in a position to present it. He had written to the current Duke of Ashcombe himself, under a forged account of the Ashbourne family's ruin, painting Seraphina as unstable, indebted, unfit for any respectable marriage, poisoning the very well from which her salvation might have come before she ever had the chance to drink from it. Worse still, Hobbs had learned, through a groom sympathetic to their cause, that Casworth intended to present his own ward, a distant relation with no claim to the Ashbourne name, but a face pliable enough for his purposes, as though she were Seraphina herself, to secure the marriage and the fortune it protected, while the real heiress vanished from society entirely, declared too grief-stricken and unwell to appear in public. It was, Hobbs said grimly, a plan elegant in its cruelty, for who would question a duke's new bride when the man arranging the match himself vouched for her identity? And who would believe a penniless, supposedly unstable young woman who claimed to be someone else entirely? Seraphina understood then that she had only two paths remaining. She could fight Casworth in the open, contest his claims through solicitors and courts that moved slower than his schemes and answered, more often than not, to men of his class and connection. Or she could vanish before he could erase her, slip beneath the very household that intended to steal her name, and find her way close enough to the truth to seize it back before the wedding he was engineering could ever take place. Hobbs, against every instinct of a lifetime spent protecting the Ashbourne family through proper channels, was the one who suggested the second path. because he alone understood that Casworth's power lay entirely in controlling what the world believed, and that the safest place to hide from a liar was inside the story he had already told. If Casworth had convinced the Duke of Ashcombe's household that the real Seraphina was unstable and unfit, then no one there would think to look for her among their own staff. And so, on a grey morning in early autumn, Lady Seraphina Ashbourne cut the sleeves from a plain wool dress, bound her dark hair beneath a servant's cap, and walked through the servants' entrance of Ashcombe House under the name Elena Winters, seeking employment as a housemaid, with no possession in the world but a folded, sealed contract sewn into the lining of her only remaining petticoat. The steward of Ashcombe House, a stern woman named Mrs. Pruitt, looked Seraphina over with the particular suspicion of someone who had turned away 100 girls claiming references they did not possess, and for a moment Seraphina believed the entire desperate plan would end before it began, on a doorstep, in the cold. But fortune, or perhaps something closer to fate, intervened in the form of an under-housemaid who had left the household abruptly the week before, under circumstances no one seemed willing to discuss. Leaving a vacancy, Mrs. Pruitt was reluctant to advertise too widely, given the season's demand for reliable staff. Seraphina's careful posture, her clear speech schooled by governesses she now pretended never to have had, might have raised questions in a fuller household, but Mrs. Pruitt was tired, understaffed, and inclined to believe that a girl, desperate enough to seek work, with no letters of character, was simply a girl who had fallen on hard times, as so many had that year. She was given a room beneath the eaves, a uniform 2 sizes too large, and a warning that the Duke himself was a private, exacting man who did not tolerate carelessness among his staff, before she had so much as unpacked the single bag she carried. She did not see him for nearly a week. She heard him instead, the low, measured voice that carried through the halls when he gave instructions, the particular quiet that fell over the servants whenever his study door opened. The other maids spoke of him the way people speak of weather, something to be watched and prepared for, rather than understood. A man made cold by grief, they said, for his father's death 2 years past, and colder still by a mother, the Dowager Duchess, who ran the household's social obligations with an iron will he seemed too weary to resist. They spoke, too, of an engagement everyone expected, and no one had yet seen confirmed, whispers of a bride selected by contract rather than courtship, a stranger the Duke had never met and, by the grim set of his jaw whenever the topic arose, did not particularly wish to. Seraphina listened to every word of this gossip while polishing silver in rooms she had once, in another life, imagined visiting as an honored guest rather than an invisible servant, and she felt something twist beneath her ribs each time his name was spoken, though she could not yet have said whether it was fear or fascination, or the terrible, dawning recognition that the very engagement Casworth had poisoned against her might be unfolding in this house, around her, without either party ever guessing that the true bride was already standing among them with a cloth in her hand. She first saw him properly on the 8th day, in the long gallery where she had been sent to dust portraits no one else wished to climb the ladder to reach, and he entered without announcement, the way men do in houses that belong entirely to them, and stopped short at the sight of her balanced 3 rungs up, with a cloth in one hand and a candle in the other. He did not shout, did not summon Mrs. Pruitt to scold her for some infraction of household order she could not immediately identify. He simply looked at her for a long moment with an expression she would spend the following months trying to name, something between curiosity and recognition, as though he had glimpsed her somewhere before, in a dream he could not quite recall upon waking. Then he asked, quietly, whether the portraits were very heavy with dust, and when she answered honestly that several had not been properly cleaned in years, he almost smiled, and told her to take whatever time the work required, before he turned and left, as quietly as he had come. It was nothing. It was an entire conversation held in 7 sentences between a duke and a maid who was not permitted to raise her eyes above his collar. And yet Seraphina climbed down from that ladder with her heart beating in a rhythm she did not recognize, and she understood, with the particular dread of someone watching a trap close slowly around her own feet, that hiding from this man was going to be far more difficult than hiding from Casworth had ever been. His name, she learned properly that same week, was Alaric Thorne, Duke of Ashcombe, and the weight of that title sat on him the way a borrowed coat sits on a man still growing into its shoulders, present but uncomfortable, worn out of necessity rather than pride. The other servants whispered that he had not wanted the dukedom at all, that he had spent his younger years content to remain his father's second concern, free to study architecture and travel and correspond with scholars on subjects that interested no one else in his family, until his elder brother's sudden death from fever 5 years past had rearranged the entire shape of his future without asking his consent. 2 years later his father followed, and Alaric Thorne had inherited not only a title he never sought, but a mother whose grief had calcified into a fierce and controlling insistence that the family's fortunes be secured through marriage before further tragedy could unmake them entirely. It was the Dowager Duchess, Seraphina came to understand, who had corresponded with a man calling himself Reginald Casworth regarding the fulfillment of an old contract, believing she was securing her son's future to a respectable, biddable young woman of appropriate fortune, never once suspecting that the man she corresponded with was actively working to erase the very bride the contract had named. Seraphina's days settled, despite everything, into a rhythm she had not expected to find bearable. She rose before dawn to lay fires in rooms grander than any she had slept in as a girl, carried water and linens through corridors lined with paintings of ancestors who would have been, by that ruined contract, her husband's family as much as her own, and in the quiet hours between duties, she began, carefully, to search. She could not simply demand to see the household's correspondence, could not ask after a contract without revealing exactly who she was to a house she did not yet trust, and so she searched the way servants search, through overheard conversation, through papers left carelessly on desks she was meant only to dust, through the particular intelligence of a woman who understood ledgers and legal language far better than any maid Mrs. Pruitt had ever employed, though she was careful, always, to let no one glimpse that understanding. She found, within a month, enough fragments to confirm her worst fears. The Dowager Duchess had indeed received letters from Casworth, letters that spoke of a bride to be presented within the year, a bride Casworth described in terms so favorable, so carefully engineered to please a grieving mother's hopes, that Seraphina understood at last the full shape of the deception awaiting her. Casworth's ward, a young woman named Delphine Ferrers, was being groomed to appear in society as though she were the true Seraphina Ashbourne, prepared with false references and forged introductions to walk into this house and this marriage, while the real heiress remained buried beneath a servant's cap, 2 floors below the very ballroom where her wedding would eventually be announced. She might have fled the house entirely upon learning this, might have taken the contract sewn into her petticoat, straight to a solicitor or a magistrate, and thrown herself upon the mercy of English law, except that Hobbs, in coded letters delivered through a sympathetic undergroom, warned her that Casworth had already prepared for exactly such a move, had already ensured that any solicitor she approached would find her claims dismissed as the ravings of a grief-mad girl already declared unstable by her own family. The only proof that mattered, Hobbs wrote, was the contract itself, and the only chance of using it lay in reaching the Duke directly, in person, with evidence undeniable enough that even a mother's ambition could not overrule it. And so Seraphina remained, dusting portraits and laying fires, watching Alaric Thorne from corners he did not know to search, waiting for a moment she could not yet name, while somewhere in London, a young woman she had never met was being fitted for gowns meant to belong to her. It was in November, with the first frost silvering the gardens beyond the kitchen windows, that Seraphina and the Duke began, without either of them fully acknowledging it, to speak. It began accidentally, as such things often do, when she was sent to deliver a tray to his study late one evening, and found him not at his desk, but at the window, staring out at the dark garden, with an expression of such profound weariness that she forgot, for one unguarded moment, to keep her eyes lowered, as a maid ought. He caught her looking. Instead of reprimanding her, he asked what she saw when she looked at him, a strange, unguarded question no duke should ask a servant, and she, equally unguarded, told him he looked like a man carrying furniture up a staircase built for someone else's house. He laughed then, a short, surprised sound, as though laughter itself were a language he had nearly forgotten how to speak, and told her that was, in fact, exactly how it felt. From that evening forward, small conversations accumulated between them, like snow gathering unnoticed, until it could no longer be ignored. Brief exchanges over books left open in the library, over a wilted rose she rescued from a vase he had forgotten to have refreshed, over the particular ache of losing a father too soon, a grief she confessed only in careful, edited fragments that never once mentioned the name Ashbourne. He began to seek her out, she realized slowly, in the way a lonely man seeks out the one honest voice in a house full of careful, calculated ones, and she found herself, despite every warning Hobbs had given her, despite every danger such closeness invited, unable to make herself stop answering him honestly in return. It was during one such conversation, in early December, that he first mentioned the engagement directly, standing in the long gallery beneath the portraits she had spent so many hours cleaning, and told her, with a bitterness he rarely allowed himself to show, that he was to be married within the year to a woman he had never met, a woman his mother assured him was gentle and accomplished and utterly, entirely a stranger, and that he had begun to wonder whether he was permitted any say at all in the shape of his own future. Seraphina stood very still as he spoke, her heart climbing into her throat, because she understood, with terrible clarity, that the stranger he described with such resignation was meant to be her, was in fact promised to be her by a contract sewn into the very petticoat she wore beneath her uniform, and that the woman actually being prepared to take her place was neither gentle nor accomplished, but a carefully coached impostor, selected by a man who had murdered her father to secure this exact deception. She wanted, in that moment, more than she had wanted anything in the 8 months since her father's carriage failed to come home, to tell him everything, to pull the contract from its hiding place and lay the entire truth before him like a confession. But Hobbs's warnings echoed too loudly, and the memory of Casworth's smile at her father's funeral rose too vividly, and she understood that a truth told too soon, without proof strong enough to survive Casworth's inevitable denials, would end not in justice, but in her own ruin, dismissed as a servant's desperate fantasy before she ever reached the man who could confirm it. And so she said nothing, only asked, quietly, whether he had ever considered that the woman his mother described might not be the woman who eventually arrived, and watched something shift behind his eyes, a suspicion she had not intended to plant, but could not now uproot, before Mrs. Pruitt's footsteps in the corridor forced them both back into the careful silence their positions required. Winter deepened, and with it, the danger surrounding Seraphina deepened as well, for Casworth, growing impatient with the pace of his own scheme, moved the timeline of Delphine Ferrers's introduction forward by several months, meaning to have the false engagement announced by the new year, rather than waiting for spring as originally planned. Seraphina learned this from a letter she was never meant to see, left carelessly among the Dowager Duchess's correspondence while she laid a fire in the drawing-room, a letter confirming that Miss Ferrers would arrive at Ashcombe House in a matter of weeks to be formally presented as the bride named in the old Ashbourne contract. She stood frozen before that fire for a full minute, the letter trembling in her hand, understanding that the careful, patient plan she and Hobbs had built, the plan to gather proof slowly and present it when the moment was safest, no longer had the luxury of time. Delphine Ferrers would arrive within weeks. Once she did, once the household and society at large accepted her as Seraphina Ashbourne, the deception would harden into a truth no contract, no testimony, no desperate maid's confession could easily undo. Seraphina folded the letter, returned it exactly as she had found it, and understood that she now had only one path remaining, and it required trusting Alaric Thorne with the truth, before she was fully prepared to survive whatever came of that trust. She chose the night of the first snowfall to tell him, not out of any romantic notion of symbolism, but because it was the one evening she knew with certainty that Mrs. Pruitt would be occupied below stairs, managing a delayed shipment of coal, leaving the upper corridors emptier than usual. She found Alaric in his study, as she had hoped, and she did not wait for him to speak first, did not allow herself the cowardice of easing into the confession slowly, because she understood that hesitation now would only invite discovery before the truth could be told at all. She removed her cap first, an act so small and yet so enormous that his expression shifted instantly from mild surprise to something far more alert, and she told him, in a voice that shook, despite every effort to steady it, that her name was not Elena Winters, that she had never been a housemaid until 8 months ago, that she was Seraphina Ashbourne, the daughter of Lord Edmund Ashbourne, and the true bride named in the contract his own mother believed she was honoring. She watched his face as she spoke, watched disbelief war with something that looked almost like recognition, as though some part of him had suspected all along that the woman he had grown to trust in stolen conversations was never quite what she appeared to be. She told him of her father's death, of the broken carriage wheel Hobbs had examined before it was destroyed, of Casworth's seizure of the estate, of the forged debts, and the false ward being groomed to steal her name and her marriage both. And when she reached into the hidden seam of her petticoat and produced the contract itself, worn soft with months of careful hiding, she watched Alaric Thorne read his own father's signature beside a name he had heard his mother speak for months, as though it belonged to a stranger arriving in a matter of weeks, and she understood, in the terrible silence that followed, that she had just placed the entirety of her future, and quite possibly her safety, into the hands of a man she had known for less than 3 months, under an assumed name, in a house that was not yet, and might never be, truly hers. He did not speak for a long moment after reading the contract, and Seraphina stood before him with her cap in her hand and her heart hammering hard enough that she felt certain he could hear it across the small distance between them. And when he finally raised his eyes to hers, they were not filled with the disbelief she had braced for, but with something closer to fury, though she understood almost immediately that the fury was not directed at her. He asked her, very quietly, how long she had known that Casworth intended to install an impostor in her place, and when she answered honestly, weeks now, he asked why she had not come to him sooner, and she told him the truth, that she had feared a servant's unproven claims would be dismissed before they ever reached him properly, that Casworth had spent months ensuring any accusation she made would sound like the ravings of a woman already declared unstable by her own family, and that she had needed proof strong enough to survive that inevitable denial. He was quiet again after that, turning the contract over in his hands as though the paper itself might offer some further answer, and then he told her something that shifted the entire shape of the danger surrounding them both. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, had grown suspicious of Casworth herself in recent weeks, troubled by inconsistencies in his correspondence, by the peculiar insistence on moving the engagement forward, by a solicitor's offhand remark regarding the unusually rapid settlement of the Ashbourne estate's debts. She had said nothing to her son directly, unwilling to voice a suspicion she could not yet prove, but Alaric had noticed her unease, and now, holding proof of exactly the deception she feared, he understood they had perhaps one advantage Casworth did not yet know they possessed, a mother's doubt already taking root before the impostor had even arrived to be tested against it. But an advantage, Alaric warned her, was not the same as safety, and the danger facing Seraphina had, if anything, sharpened now that the contract existed openly between them, rather than hidden in a petticoat seam. Casworth had already killed once, if Hobbs's account of the carriage wheel could be trusted, and a man capable of murdering his own cousin to secure an inheritance would not hesitate to remove a maid who threatened to unravel months of careful deception, particularly a maid who could prove her claim with a legally binding document. Alaric insisted that very night that Seraphina could no longer remain within the household under her false name, not because he doubted her, but because Mrs. Pruitt's records, however carelessly kept, created a paper trail Casworth's allies could exploit the moment suspicion turned toward Ashcombe House, and because the servants' hall, however loyal in appearance, was not immune to the kind of coin Casworth had already proven willing to spend. He proposed, instead, a plan so audacious that Serafina initially argued against it out of pure disbelief that it could possibly succeed, rather than hiding her further, rather than smuggling her away to safety while he pursued the matter through solicitors and courts that might take months or years to rule in her favor. He would present her to society himself, immediately, as his intended bride, using the very contract Casworth had tried to bury as the foundation of a legitimate, undeniable engagement, announced with enough speed and enough public certainty that Casworth would find himself trapped by his own scheme, forced either to expose his fraud by objecting to a match his own forged letters had originally arranged, or to watch his impostor arrive in London to find the position she was meant to fill already, publicly, permanently occupied. It was a plan that required Serafina to step fully into the light after 8 months spent making herself as invisible as possible, to walk into ballrooms and drawing rooms under her true name while Casworth still controlled the narrative of her supposed instability, to trust that a duke's word and a father's signature would outweigh months of carefully cultivated rumor. It required, too, a trust in Alaric Thorne that frightened her nearly as much as Casworth's schemes did, because she understood, standing in that study with snow gathering silently against the windows, that she was no longer simply fighting to reclaim an inheritance. She was placing her entire future, her name, her safety, and quite possibly her heart, into the hands of a man she had loved first as a stranger, dusting his portraits, and only now, in this single unraveling night, as the person she actually was. They moved with a speed that startled even the household, for Alaric Thorne, who had spent 2 years as Duke, governing every decision with careful, deliberate reluctance, suddenly acted with the decisiveness of a man who understood exactly how little time remained before Casworth's impostor arrived to poison every truth Serafina might later try to tell. He went to his mother first, before dawn, and Serafina waited in an unused parlor through what felt like the longest hour of her life, listening to the low murmur of voices behind a closed door, unable to discern whether the Dowager Duchess's response would be fury or relief. When the door finally opened, it was not Alaric who entered first, but his mother, a tall, silver-haired woman whose eyes moved over Serafina with a scrutiny so thorough it felt almost physical, and Serafina braced herself for rejection, for the particular cruelty of a woman who had spent months anticipating a daughter-in-law, now forced to accept a servant instead. But the Dowager Duchess, after a long silence, said only that she had known, somehow, that something about Casworth's correspondence had never sat correctly in her mind, that a mother's instinct for deception, honed by years of managing a household full of ambitious relations, had been trying to warn her for weeks, and that she would rather welcome a bride who had survived genuine hardship than one who had been polished into false perfection by a man she now understood to be capable of murder. The formal reclamation of Serafina's identity, however, could not rest on family sentiment alone, and it was here that Hobbes's months of careful, patient work proved essential, for the old steward had spent the autumn gathering more than the contract alone, quietly collecting statements from servants dismissed by Casworth, who had witnessed the destruction of the carriage wheel, securing an affidavit from the coroner's assistant, who had noted irregularities in the original examination, but had been paid, he now admitted with evident shame, to keep his observations quiet, and locating the moneylender whose forged debt had first been used to justify Casworth's seizure of the estate, a man who, faced with the prospect of prosecution for his own role in the fraud, proved remarkably willing to testify against the cousin who had orchestrated the entire scheme. Alaric placed his own solicitors at the disposal of this gathering evidence, and within a fortnight, what had been a desperate maid's hidden contract had become a formal legal case, presented not to a single magistrate who might be swayed by Casworth's connections, but to a panel convened at the Dowager Duchess's insistence, drawing on her own considerable influence to ensure the proceedings could not be quietly buried the way Casworth had buried every inconvenient truth before. Casworth, when he finally understood the trap closing around him, did not surrender easily. He arrived at Ashcombe House himself, uninvited, 3 days before the formal engagement announcement, demanding an audience with a fury so poorly disguised as concern that even the footman who admitted him exchanged a glance with Serafina across the entrance hall, both of them understanding immediately that the mask Casworth had worn so convincingly at her father's funeral had finally begun to slip. He accused her, in front of Alaric and the Dowager Duchess both, of having fled her family in a fit of hysteria, of concocting an elaborate fantasy to entrap a duke, of forging the very contract she claimed to have discovered, and for one terrible moment, listening to his voice, so calm, so reasonable, so exactly the voice he had used to convince an entire county of his sorrow at her father's grave. Serafina felt the old fear rise in her chest, the fear that had driven her into a servant's uniform in the first place, the fear that no one would ever believe her over a man so practiced in the art of being believed. But Alaric did not waver, and it was in this moment, more than any other, that Serafina understood the full measure of the man she had fallen in love with, while dusting his portraits under a false name. He told Casworth, in a voice colder than Serafina had ever heard him use, that he had spent the previous fortnight in correspondence with a coroner's assistant, a dismissed groundskeeper, and a moneylender, each of whom told a story that made Casworth's accusations sound considerably less credible than the testimony of the woman standing beside him, and that the panel convened to review the matter would hear all of it, in full, within the week. It was the moneylender's testimony that finally broke the case entirely open, for the man, desperate to avoid prosecution, produced not only evidence of the forged debt, but a letter in Casworth's own hand, requesting the falsification, a letter Casworth had believed destroyed years ago, but which the moneylender, with the particular self-preservation of men in his profession, had quietly retained as insurance against exactly the kind of betrayal he now feared from his co-conspirator. Presented before the panel, alongside Hobbes's account of the carriage wheel and the coroner's assistant's reluctant confirmation of irregularities in the original examination, the letter left Casworth's protestations of innocence in ruins. He was arrested within the same week that Delphine Ferrers, entirely unaware until that moment of the true nature of the role she had been groomed to play, arrived in London only to learn that the man who had promised her a title and a fortune was instead facing charges of fraud and the suspected murder of the very cousin whose life he had spent months attempting to erase. And so it was that on a night in early spring, in the grand ballroom of Ashcombe House, beneath chandeliers that had once seemed to Serafina like distant stars, glimpsed only from the servants' stairs, Alaric Thorne, Duke of Ashcombe, slid onto her hand a ring that had waited, unclaimed, since the day their fathers first signed a contract meant to unite two houses, long before either child understood what love might eventually make of that arrangement. She stood in a gown that was, this time, entirely her own, in a house that recognized her, at last, by her true name, surrounded by a household that had once known her only as a quiet maid dusting portraits in corners no one thought to search, and she understood that every hardship of the past year, every stolen truth and hidden contract and desperate, dangerous choice had led not to the ruin Casworth intended, but to a life reclaimed more fully than she could have imagined possible, on the night her father's carriage failed to come home. The engagement was announced before the assembled guests of London society, the true story of the ash-worn heiress, and the Duke, who had unknowingly fallen in love with her while she served in his own household, spreading through the city faster than any rumour Casworth had ever managed to spin, until it became, in time, not a scandal to be whispered about in careful tones, but a legend told openly, the story of a woman who lost everything, and, through patience, courage, and a truth finally spoken at the right moment, found her way back to all of it, and to a love that had been waiting for her, unknowingly, from the very first night she climbed a ladder to dust his family's portraits, and looked, for the first time, into the eyes of the man she was always meant to marry, though neither of them yet understood how far they would have to travel, and how much they would have to risk, before that truth could finally, safely, be spoken aloud beneath a chandelier bright enough to banish every shadow Casworth had ever cast across her name. Yet even as the guests raised their glasses, and the orchestra began the first slow turn of a waltz written, it seemed, for exactly this occasion, Serafina understood that reclaiming a name was not the same as reclaiming a life, and that the months ahead would demand a different kind of courage than the one that had carried her through a servant's disguise. The trial of Reginald Casworth stretched on through the early weeks of spring, for a man so practiced in deception did not surrender his defense easily, and though the letter in his own hand had shattered his claims of innocence before the panel, he fought still to delay, to appeal, to summon whatever remaining allies his years of careful cultivation had purchased him. Serafina was called to testify twice, and each time she stood before the panel, she felt again the particular vertigo of speaking her father's name aloud in rooms full of strangers who had, until recently, believed the very lies Casworth had spent a year constructing. Alaric attended every session, seated always where she could find his face, the moment her composure threatened to falter, and it was this steadiness, more than any grand declaration of love, that taught her to trust the ground beneath her feet again. The estate itself took longer still to restore than the courtroom did to rule. Ashbourne House had been stripped of half its furnishings, its accounts left in the deliberate disarray Casworth had used to justify his seizure, and Serafina spent the weeks before her wedding not in the idle preparation society expected of a bride, but bent over ledgers late into the night, restoring order to a household that had nearly forgotten what honest management looked like. Hobbs stood beside her through every page, an old man finally permitted to serve the family he had protected in secret for a year, and there were evenings when Alaric found the two of them still at the study desk, long past midnight, and rather than call her away to rest, he simply drew up a third chair and took up a portion of the work himself, learning the shape of the inheritance he would soon share, not through inherited privilege, but through the same patient labor Serafina had always known. It was Delphine Ferrers, of all people, who offered Serafina the final piece of understanding she had not known she needed. The young woman Casworth had groomed to steal her identity sought her out privately after the trial's conclusion, not to beg forgiveness exactly, but to explain, in a voice hollowed by her own narrow escape from ruin, that she too had been an orphaned ward with no fortune of her own, given a choice by Casworth between compliance and destitution, never once told the full truth of the woman whose life she had been prepared to occupy. Serafina listened to her without the anger she might once have expected to feel, and found instead a strange, aching kinship with a girl who had nearly become, through different circumstances, exactly as invisible as she herself had been, made beneath a maid's cap. She could not undo what Casworth had built between them, but she could, and did, ensure that Delphine left that meeting with a small independent income and a letter of genuine character, enough to build a life of her own choosing, rather than one dictated by a man who had used them both as instruments toward the same theft. The wedding, when it finally came in early summer, was not the grand spectacle London's gossiping drawing rooms had anticipated after months of scandal and revelation, though the guest list swelled regardless, with those eager to witness the conclusion of a story they had followed with such fascination. Serafina insisted, and Alaric readily agreed, that the ceremony take place not in the cathedral favoured by dukes, but in the small stone chapel on the Ashbourne estate, where her father and mother had married a generation before, where her father's grave still lay beneath the old yew tree at the churchyard's edge. She wore her mother's gown, altered by her own hand, in evenings stolen between ledgers and testimony, and when Hobbs walked her down the short aisle in the absence of any living father to do so, she felt the old man's arm tremble beneath her hand, and understood that his loyalty, quiet and unglamorous as it had always been, deserved every bit as much honor as the title she was about to receive. Alaric waited for her at the altar with an expression she had first glimpsed on a ladder in the long gallery, dusting portraits under a name that was never truly hers, an expression of quiet, startled recognition, as though even now, having known the full truth of her for months, he still could not quite believe his fortune in finding her. When he spoke his vows, he departed briefly from the words expected of a duke, and told her, before the assembled witnesses, that he had fallen in love with her honesty long before he ever knew her name, that whatever title she carried, whatever fortune surrounded her, the woman he had chosen was the one who told him the truth about a wilted rose and a weary man carrying furniture up the wrong staircase, and that he intended to spend the whole of his life ensuring she never again had reason to hide who she truly was. Serafina, who had spent a year learning the particular discipline of silence, found herself, in that moment, entirely unable to keep her composure, and the small chapel, full of servants and tenants, and the handful of noble guests who had come to witness what the newspapers were already calling the most remarkable engagement of the decade, watched the Duke of Ashcombe kiss his bride before the vows were even fully spoken, a breach of custom no one in attendance thought to mind in the slightest. In the years that followed, Ashbourne House and Ashcombe House were joined not merely by marriage, but by the careful, patient restoration Serafina had begun that first winter with a ledger and a candle. The estate returned to a prosperity it had not known since her father's lifetime, its tenants and servants treated, at her insistence, with the same dignity she herself had been denied during her months in disguise. Reginald Casworth was convicted at last on charges of fraud and conspiracy, the murder charge proving harder to fully prove, though the weight of circumstantial evidence left little doubt in the minds of anyone who had followed the case, and he spent the remainder of his days stripped of every title and connection he had killed to obtain, a fate Serafina found she could regard, in time, not with triumphant satisfaction, but with the quieter relief of a woman who had simply, finally, been allowed to stop running. Hobbs remained at Ashbourne House until his own death many years later, insisting to the end that he had done nothing more than his duty, though the portrait Serafina commissioned of him, hung in the very gallery she had once dusted in secret, told a rather different story to everyone who paused to read the inscription beneath it. And on quiet evenings, long after the scandal had faded into the kind of story told fondly rather than urgently, Serafina would sometimes find herself once more in that long gallery, standing before the portraits she had climbed a ladder to clean under a false name, and Alaric would find her there, and ask, as he always did, what she saw when she looked at the walls of a house that had once been strange to her and was now, entirely and unshakably, her own. She would tell him, each time, some small truth she had not yet spoken aloud, because she had learned in the hardest year of her life that love built on honesty, however delayed, however dangerous to speak, was the only kind of love worth the keeping, and that the girl who once hid her name beneath a servant's cap had become, in the end, exactly the woman that name was always meant to describe.